When I asked what time the baby's shower was, my daughter looked at me without hesitation and said, "Oh, we had it yesterday." Those words didn't just land in the air. They slammed into me like the crack of a hammer against glass. For a moment, I thought I must have misheard her. I replayed the sentence in my mind, searching for some softer version of it that didn't carry such finality, but no matter how I turned it, the meaning stayed sharp. The baby's shower, the celebration of my first grandchild, the event I had been waiting for with anticipation and pride, had already happened, and I hadn't been told. My mouth went dry, and I tried to steady myself against the counter where I had been standing just seconds earlier, casually holding a mug of coffee, thinking we were about to discuss plans for the day. The sunlight from the kitchen window was bright, almost too bright, spilling across the floor in hard, unflinching lines. It felt like the world was mocking me with its normalcy, as if everything should keep moving forward while I stood there gutted, blindsided by a sentence that seemed impossible. I forced myself to swallow, my throat tight as if it had turned to stone. "What do you mean, yesterday?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, almost strangled. I wanted her to laugh, to tell me it was a joke, to say of course I was invited, that I must have misunderstood something. But instead, she looked down at her phone, scrolling, her face unreadable. "We just decided it was easier that way," she said flatly, almost dismissively. "You know how things get complicated with scheduling, and Michael's family wanted to handle most of it. They had their own way of doing things." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried no warmth, no apology, no trace of guilt that she had cut me out of one of the most important moments of her life. The room felt colder, though I knew the thermostat hadn't changed. My fingers tightened around the ceramic mug until I worried it might shatter in my hand. "Easier," I repeated slowly, tasting the bitterness of the word. "Easier for who?" "Certainly not for me. Certainly not for the grandfather of your child." She shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't her decision alone. This had her husband's fingerprints all over it, and more than that, it reeked of his parents' disdain. They had never made a secret of the fact that they thought they were better than me, more refined, more educated, more worthy of shaping my daughter's future than the man who had raised her. Now, it was as if they had drawn a line and shoved me to the other side, excluding me from the circle of family, as though I were nothing more than an afterthought. My chest ached, not from age or weakness, but from a raw wound opening deep inside. All the sacrifices, all the years I had poured into her life, every late night, every early morning, every dollar scraped together to give her opportunities, all of it suddenly felt invisible. She had erased me in a single sentence, with the ease of someone deleting an old message from a phone. I tried to speak again, but my voice caught. For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Ordinary noises, but they seemed to mock the chaos unraveling inside me. Finally, I managed to say, "So that's it then. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even told." My words came out flat, stripped of emotion, because I knew if I let the anger or the hurt bleed through, I might shatter completely. She glanced at me, a flicker of something crossing her face. Discomfort, maybe even shame, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said softly, as though I were the unreasonable one, as though my pain were some inconvenience she wanted to brush aside. Harder than it needs to be. The phrase lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I realized then that this wasn't just about a baby shower. This was about respect, about loyalty, about the bond between a parent and a child that was supposed to be unbreakable. And in that moment, staring at her as she shifted her attention back to her phone, I knew something had broken beyond repair. I set my coffee mug down carefully on the counter, the ceramic clinking lightly against the stone surface. I straightened my back, forcing my shoulders into the kind of posture I hadn't carried in years. "Understood," I said simply. My voice was steady now, almost calm, though a storm was building inside me, growing stronger with every passing second. She looked up, startled by my tone, maybe expecting me to argue, to plead, to push my way back into the space they had denied me. But I had no intention of begging for scraps of dignity. Not anymore. I turned and walked toward the door, each step measured, deliberate. My shoes echoed softly against the hardwood floor, a sound that felt final, like the closing of a chapter. Behind me, she said my name once, uncertain, perhaps realizing too late that something had shifted. But I didn't answer. I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold beneath my palm, and pulled the door open. The air outside hit me hard, crisp, biting, full of December's edge. It cleared my head in an instant. I stepped out onto the porch and let the door close behind me, the latch clicking into place with sharpness that felt like punctuation. The house loomed behind me, filled with memories I had built, filled with the life I had worked so hard to give her. But at that moment, it felt like a stranger's home. I walked to my truck, my movement steady though my chest was tight. I climbed inside, shut the door, and sat for a moment in silence. The dashboard lights glowed faintly, the world outside still and quiet. I gripped the steering wheel, not to steady myself, but because I needed something solid to hold on to as my mind churned. The betrayal was complete. The hurt was undeniable. But as I sat there, staring at the road ahead, I felt something else rise beneath the pain, a cold, deliberate clarity. If they thought they could erase me, use me, discard me when it was convenient, they had forgotten who I was and what I was capable of. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, its sound filling the silence. And as I pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a house that no longer felt like mine, one thought burned bright in my mind. They would regret underestimating me. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The drive back from my daughter's house was one of the quietest I had ever taken, though the engine hummed steadily and the tires hissed across the winter pavement. Normally, when I drove alone, I would keep the radio on low, an oldie station or a local talk show to fill the air, but this time I didn't reach for the dial. The silence suited me. It gave me space to sort through the storm brewing in my chest. Every mile that passed seemed to stretch the distance not just between me and her house, but between me and the man I had been only hours before. I replayed the scene in my head with every turn of the wheels, her flat voice, the way her eyes had slid down her phone instead of meeting mine, the casual cruelty of the words. Oh, we had it yesterday. Not, I'm sorry, Dad, we should have called. Not even an explanation that made sense. Just a dismissal, as if I were nothing more than an afterthought. At a red light, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and felt the leather press into the lines of my palm. My mind, sharp now in a way it hadn't been in years, cataloged every slight that had led to this moment. I thought back to the wedding, when her husband's parents had thrown me a look that said I didn't belong at the table they had so carefully decorated with expensive flowers and wine glasses I couldn't pronounce. I thought of the way Michael, her husband, had slowly edged me out of conversations, making decisions about their life without ever consulting me, even when those decisions involved things I had paid for. By the time I turned onto my own street, the silence had done its work. The raw ache in my chest was still there, but it had hardened into something sharper, something that didn't wobble with uncertainty. I parked in front of my house, killed the engine, and sat there for a long while, staring at the front porch where I had spent so many summer evenings with my daughter when she was little, watching her chase fireflies across the yard. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The memory of her laughter on this porch, the image of her young face turning toward me with trust and joy, pressed hard against the reality of the woman who now cut me out of her life without hesitation. That realization should have broken me. Instead, it settled inside me like a stone, solid, heavy, unyielding. When I finally went inside, I didn't bother turning on the television or even the lights in the living room. I sat in the old recliner, the same one I had dozed off in countless times after long days of work, and let the dim light from the street lamp outside stretch across the carpet. The silence was almost oppressive at first, thick and suffocating, but the longer I sat with it, the more it became a kind of companion. I thought about calling her back, demanding an explanation, demanding at least the courtesy of being told why I had been excluded. But the phone sat heavy in my pocket, and I knew that if I reached for it, I'd be playing their game. I'd be chasing after scraps of decency, begging for a place at a table they had already set without me. and I had done enough begging in my life. So I let the phone stay in my pocket and leaned back in the chair, my eyes tracing the faint cracks in the ceiling paint. My wife, God rest her soul, would have known what to say. She always had a way of softening my anger, of reminding me that patience was stronger than rage. But she wasn't here, and maybe that was why this silence cut so deep. There was no one to lean on, no one to share the weight. It was just me and the quiet, and in that quiet I could feel the shape of what needed to come next. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second dropping like water onto stone. With every tick, the silence grew less painful and more purposeful. It became the space where my resolve took root. They thought they could erase me, reduce me to a background figure in my own daughter's life. But they had forgotten who had held things together all these years. They had forgotten whose name was on certain papers, whose sweat and money had laid the foundation for much of what they now took for granted. I thought of the mortgage I had helped pay down when Michael lost his job for 6 months. I thought of the car I had bought my daughter when she first started teaching, so she wouldn't have to ride the bus in winter. I thought of the thousands I had quietly funneled into her bank account when the bills piled higher than her salary. Each memory, instead of softening me, built another layer onto the wall inside my chest. Around midnight, I rose from the recliner and walked to my desk in the study. I opened a drawer where I kept old files, bank statements, property records, loan agreements. My fingers skimmed across the paper, pulling out folders that had sat untouched for years. I spread them across the desk, the silence of the house wrapping around me as I leaned over the documents. My eyes traced the signatures, the numbers, the terms I had once read casually but now studied with renewed intensity. The silence was no longer empty. It was instructive. It showed me where my power still lay, where their dependence on me was hidden in plain sight. My daughter might have thought she had shut me out, but these papers told another story, one in which I was far from powerless. When I finally pushed back from the desk, the clock read nearly 2 a.m. I felt tired, but it wasn't the weary exhaustion of defeat. It was a heavy calm of someone who had seen the truth and accepted it. My daughter had chosen her path. So had her husband. And now, in the silence they had gifted me, I was free to choose mine. I turned off the lamp, leaving the papers neatly stacked on the desk, and made my way upstairs. As I lay in bed, the quiet of the house pressing again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was an ally. It was a reminder that while they moved forward thinking I had been erased, I was here, waiting, planning, and preparing. The silence after betrayal is not weakness. It is the ground on which resolve is built. And by the time they realized what that silence meant, it would be too late. The morning after that sleepless night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out the window as the first light of dawn broke over the neighborhood. The silence of my home was no longer suffocating. It was steady, patient, waiting for me to give it direction. My mind drifted backward. Not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I needed to understand how all those years of sacrifice could be so easily dismissed with one sentence. To make sense of how my daughter, the child I had once carried on my shoulders and soothed through every storm, could now treat me as if I had never mattered. I thought of the earliest years, when she was just a little girl with wide eyes and a laugh that bubbled up like music. Back then, her mother and I were young and struggling. Money was always tight, but I made it my mission to keep that weight off her small shoulders. I worked long shifts, sometimes 2 jobs at once, just to ensure that there was food on the table and shoes on her feet. I remember those late nights coming home, my body aching from hours of physical labor, only to find her still awake, waiting for me by the door with her favorite storybook in hand. I never had the heart to tell her I was too tired. I would sit with her, reading until her eyes finally drooped shut, feeling her little head rest against my arm. That exhaustion never felt like a burden. It was love in its purest form. As she grew, the sacrifices only multiplied. When she wanted piano lessons, I found a way to make it happen, even if it meant skipping out on new clothes for myself or putting off repairs around the house. When she needed braces, I signed up for extra overtime, grinding through long hours in the dead of winter, my fingers numb and callous from a cold. When she reached high school and hinted at college, I quietly opened another savings account, tucking away every spare dollar, often going without luxuries, so she wouldn't have to worry about affording her future. Her mother and I had our share of disagreements about how much we should give, how far we should stretch. But in the end, we both knew our daughter was worth every sacrifice. We wanted her to have a life free from the struggles we had endured. So we poured ourselves into her future, sometimes to the point of neglecting our own needs. I put off buying a newer truck for years because tuition bills came first. Vacations were rare, and when they happened, they were simple trips, camping weekends, long drives to nearby parks. I told myself we would travel more once she was grown and secure. That was the dream that kept me going. And when the time came for her to leave for college, I drove her myself, the car packed to the roof with boxes of books, clothes, and little pieces of home. I carried those boxes up 3 flights of stairs to her dorm room, sweat pouring down my back. But I never complained. I wanted her to see, even then, that I was still her foundation, the one she could always rely on. The years that followed weren't easy. There were phone calls about tuition gaps, about rent she couldn't cover, about car troubles that threatened to derail her studies. Each time, I found a way to step in, sometimes quietly transferring money, other times driving across the state to fix whatever had broken down. I never kept a ledger. I never asked for repayment. I told myself that was what fathers did, that my role was to lift her up even when it bet my own back. When her mother passed, the bond between us seemed even more important. She was in her early 20s then, devastated and adrift, and I knew I had to be her anchor. I held her hand at the funeral, wiped her tears, and promised her that no matter what, I would always be there. And I meant it. I cooked her meals when she didn't have the strength. I sat with her in silence when words failed, and I helped her finish out her degree when grief made her falter. Those were hard years, but they were also the years that deepened my commitment to her. She was my only child, and I told myself that all my sacrifices were not just necessary, but worthwhile, because they ensured she would never feel abandoned. Then came Michael. At first, I wanted to believe he was a good man, someone who would cherish her the way I did. I welcomed him, even when my instincts whispered doubts. When they got engaged, I poured what I could into helping with the wedding. I cut corners, dipped into savings, and even took out a small loan to make sure the day was perfect. When they bought their first house, I contributed to the down payment, telling myself it was just another investment in her happiness. When Michael lost his job for half a year, I shouldered their mortgage payments to keep them afloat. The pattern was always the same. Whenever there was a need, I stepped in, not because I was asked to, but because I couldn't stand the thought of her struggling. I wanted her to feel secure, to build her life without the constant shadow of financial worry that had haunted mine. And each time, I told myself this was love, this was duty, this was what a father was meant to do. Sitting at that table now, all those memories press against me. Each sacrifice I had made was like a brick, and together they formed the foundation of her entire adult life. And yet, in a single sentence, she had managed to sweep it aside, as if it were nothing more than dust. The coffee in my mug had turned lukewarm, but I lifted it anyway, sipping absent-mindedly as I stared out the window at the empty street. I wondered how she could forget so easily. How could she not see the cost of what I had given? How could she dismiss me, erase me, as if my presence was optional, as if my years of sacrifice didn't matter? The truth was hard to swallow, but it became clearer the longer I sat there. Sacrifices mean nothing to those who choose to forget them. Gratitude can't be demanded, and sometimes even love isn't enough to earn respect. I set the mug down with a steady hand and let out a long breath. The years of sacrifice were real, undeniable, etched into every scar on my hands, every sleepless night I had endured. But they had not been enough to keep me from being pushed aside. And now, looking back on all I had given, I realized those sacrifices had also given me something unexpected: leverage. Because buried in those years were not just gifts and favors, but investments. Investments that had tied her life to mine in ways she didn't fully understand. Investments that would remind her, sooner or later, that I was not so easily erased. And as the morning light grew stronger, spilling across the kitchen floor, I knew that those sacrifices, though ignored, would become the very tools I needed to reclaim my dignity. It is easy to pretend that a single betrayal comes out of nowhere. That one sentence, "Oh, we had it yesterday," is the whole story. But as I sat there in the kitchen that morning, watching the sunlight creep across the floor, I realized the truth had been building for years. My daughter's words were not just her own. They carried the weight of other voices, other judgments, other hands pulling strings behind scenes. And those hands belonged to Michael and his family. I had never been blind to it. From the first time I met them, I knew there was a distance between us, one that no handshake or polite smile could bridge. They came from a world different than mine, one where money flowed more easily, where vacations abroad and weekend retreats were normal. I grew up learning the value of every dollar, stretching paychecks, fixing instead of replacing. I never felt ashamed of it, because I knew the kind of man I was: steady, reliable, willing to sacrifice. But around them, it was as if my entire life was being silently measured and found lacking. Michael's parents had a way of making their superiority known without ever saying a word. At dinners, they would talk about investments, about wine vintages, about European architecture, always in that careful way that reminded me how small my world was compared to theirs. When I tried to contribute, to share my stories, they would nod politely, but their eyes drifted elsewhere, signaling that my words were background noise rather than part of the main conversation. Even Michael, though he never said outright, seemed to carry that same quiet dismissal. He was polite to my face, even respectful at times, but there was always a flicker in his tone, a stiffness that made me feel like I was tolerated rather than welcomed. When my daughter was around, he played the part of the attentive husband. But when it was just the two of us, the warmth faded. It was as if he saw me as a necessary burden, someone whose approval he needed only because of my relationship to her, not because he valued me as a person. I noticed the small shifts first. Family gatherings began to revolve around his parents' schedule. Birthdays, holidays, even Sunday dinners started moving to their home, their rules. I didn't mind at first. Families blend, compromises are made. But as the months passed, my daughter seemed less interested in spending time in the house where she grew up. When she did come over, it was often hurried, her phone buzzing with reminders of other plans. I tried to tell myself it was just the rhythm of marriage, the natural pull of a new family. But then came the sharper moments where the divide was unmistakable. I remember one Thanksgiving clearly. I had spent hours preparing a turkey, cooking the sides, setting the table just the way her mother used to. I waited all afternoon, expecting her and Michael to arrive. Finally, I got a call, her voice rushed and apologetic. "Dad, we're actually at Michael's parents' house. They invited us, and it just seemed easier. I'm so sorry. We'll come by later this week." Later that week came and went, and the leftovers in my fridge told the story better than her words ever could. I sat alone at the table that night, carving slices of turkey for myself, the silence heavier than it should have been. That was when I began to see the pattern clearly. Every holiday, every milestone, shifted further into their orbit. It wasn't just holidays either. Decisions that should have involved me quietly excluded me. When they bought their house, I learned after the fact that Michael's parents had negotiated most of the details. When they chose names for the baby, I was told only once it had already been decided, as though my opinion had no place in the conversation. Each time, I swallowed the hurt, telling myself not to make it harder for her, not to put her in the middle. But inside, the resentment grew. The slights became sharper as time went on. Once, during a dinner at their home, I overheard Michael's mother say, "Well, we'll make sure the baby has proper guidance, won't we?" Her tone was sweet, her smile flawless, but the implication cut deep. Proper guidance. As if I, the man who had raised my daughter through sacrifice and love, had somehow failed in that role. I caught my daughter's eye then, but she looked away quickly, pretending she hadn't heard. That was the worst of it, not their disdain, but her silence. She didn't defend me, didn't push back. Maybe she was caught in the middle. Maybe she didn't know how to balance loyalty between two families. But each time she stayed quiet, it felt like another piece of our bond slipped away. Michael played his part well. He never said anything openly disrespectful, but his choices spoke loudly. When bills came due, he accepted my help without hesitation, but when his parents were in the room, he emphasized their support instead. He wanted the stability I provided, but not the acknowledgement. And slowly, he began to reshape my daughter's perspective. The woman who once called me for every piece of advice now deferred to him. The daughter who used to bring her joys and sorrows to my door began saving them for their dinner table instead. I told myself I wouldn't let bitterness eat me alive, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of their influence. It was there in the way my daughter's tone changed when she spoke about their plans. It was there in how she seemed embarrassed by the simplicity of my life, the way she brushed off my offers to host, the way she shifted conversations to avoid comparisons. The baby shower was simply the culmination of all these smaller moments, the natural result of years of slow erosion. By the time she told me it had already happened, their influence had seeped so deep into her life that my exclusion seemed almost inevitable. They had been pulling the strings for years, and I had let them, thinking that patience and quiet sacrifice would keep me close to her. But sitting there in my kitchen, piecing it all together, I realized patience had been a mistake. Silence had not protected me. It had given them room to push me out. And now, if I wanted to reclaim any sense of dignity, I could no longer stand on the sidelines. The outsiders had made their move, and they thought they had won, but they had underestimated the very man who had built the foundation they now stood on. When I walked back into my house after that conversation with my daughter, the place felt different, even though nothing inside had changed. The walls were the same pale color I had painted years ago. The old recliner still sat in the corner of the living room. The photographs of my late wife and daughter still lined the mantel. Yet everything seemed heavier, as if the betrayal I had just endured had seeped into the very foundation of the house. The silence inside those walls pressed against me like a weight I could not shake. I sank into the recliner and let my body settle, though my mind refused to rest. It raced through everything that had happened, not just yesterday, but over the past several years. I couldn't help but hear her words again, clear as if she were still standing in front of me. "Oh, we had it yesterday." The casualness of it was what stung the most. There was no regret in her voice, no hesitation, no sense that she had denied me something important. To her, it was just another detail of her life, spoken as if it meant nothing. To me, it was a knife. I closed my eyes and leaned back, listening to the house. It had its usual sounds, the faint creak of wood, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. But in the stillness, every sound seemed magnified, echoing in ways that only reminded me of how empty the place was. For years, my daughter had filled this house with life. She had run through these rooms, laughed in this kitchen, cried in her bedroom upstairs. I had built my life around those sounds, around being the one who provided and protected. And now, sitting there in the aftermath of her betrayal, I felt the hollowness of being left behind. It was not the first time I had been hurt in life. I had lost my wife far too soon, endured financial struggles, and carried the weight of responsibility through years that tested me in ways most people never saw. But this cut deeper because it came from the one person I thought would always see me, always value me, always remember who I was in her life. I thought about the night after her mother's funeral, when she had curled up on the couch with me, her face pressed into my shoulder, and whispered, "Don't leave me, Dad. You're all I have." I had held her then, promising that I would never let her go through life alone. I kept that promise through every hardship, every bill, every sleepless night. And now, she had chosen to leave me behind instead. The betrayal had layers, and I felt each one pressing down on me. There was the obvious wound of missing the baby's shower, of being denied the chance to celebrate my first grandchild, to stand there with pride as her father. But beneath that, there was a deeper betrayal of years of sacrifice being erased, of a bond being taken for granted until it snapped. My thoughts circled back again, and again to the look on her face when she told me. She hadn't looked at me with anger or even with pity. She had looked at me with indifference. And in some ways, that was worse. Anger at least acknowledges the other person's importance. Indifference says they no longer matter. I opened my eyes and stared at the photographs on the mantel. There was one of her as a child, missing her front teeth, smiling so wide it lit up the whole frame. Another of her high school graduation, me standing beside her in a worn suit, my chest puffed with pride as she held her diploma. And then there was a photo of her wedding, where I had walked her down the aisle, my hand steady even though my heart had been heavy with the realization that she was beginning a new chapter without her mother there to witness it. Each photo was proof of the years I had been present, proof of the sacrifices I had made. And yet, in her eyes now, all of that seemed invisible. The longer I sat there, the more the anger began to stir beneath the grief. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, steady, the kind of anger that doesn't flare and burn out, but smolders until it becomes something stronger. I thought about every mortgage payment I had covered when Michael had lost his job, about every bill I had paid without question, about every sacrifice I had made to give her the life she wanted. And now, when it came time for her to show me even the smallest measure of respect, she had cut me out entirely. I leaned forward, rested my elbows on my knees, and pressed my hands together. My breathing was slow, deliberate, as if I were teaching myself how to remain calm. The betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it had also sharpened something inside me. For the first time in years, I saw things clearly. I had spent too long giving, too long sacrificing, too long believing that love and duty would be enough to protect me from being discarded. But love, when it is one-sided, becomes weakness, and duty, when it is unappreciated, becomes a chain around your own neck. The house seemed to whisper these truths back to me. Every creak of the floor, every hum of the appliances, every shadow on the wall carried the same message. I had been used. And if I didn't act, if I didn't change the way I lived, I would continue to be used until there was nothing left of me. The betrayal was not just a wound. It was a lesson. Sitting there alone, I realized that I had allowed this to happen by always giving without boundaries, by never demanding respect, by letting Michael and his family push me further to the margins. I had told myself it was patience, told myself it was love, but really it was fear. Fear of losing her, fear of being left alone. But now that the worst had already happened, now that I had been excluded and betrayed, the fear had no power over me. I stood up and walked slowly to the mantel, my eyes lingering on the photographs. For a moment, I reached out and touched the frame of her graduation photo, my finger tracing the edge. The memory of that day washed over me. The pride, the hope, the belief that all my sacrifices had led to something good. That memory hurt now, but it also fueled me, because if I had given that much, if I had sacrificed that much, then I had every right to demand something in return. I turned away from the photographs and looked toward the study, where the papers I had laid out the night before still sat on the desk. Bank records, property documents, loan agreements. They were reminders of the leverage I still held, the ties between us that could not be erased by one careless sentence. And in that moment, the loneliness of betrayal gave way to something else. Determination. Yes, I was alone. Yes, I had been betrayed. But I was not powerless. And if they thought they could erase me from their lives so easily, they were about to learn how wrong they were. That evening, after hours of pacing to the house and picking at food I barely tasted, I found myself drawn upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my wife. It had been years since she passed, yet the room still carried her presence in quiet, unshakable ways. The quilt she had made with her own hands still covered the bed. Her perfume bottle, though long empty, still stood on the dresser. In the corner, an old cedar chest held keepsakes from a life we had built together. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the chest, and the memories came back with a force that nearly knocked the air out of me. It was in this room that we had whispered late into the night about our daughter's future, about the kind of life we wanted her to have. My wife had always been the dreamer between us, full of ideas and hopes, while I was the one who figured out how to make them real. She would say, "She deserves more than we ever had," and I would nod, knowing I'd worked myself to bone to give her that. It was in those quiet conversations that the promises were made. Unspoken at first, then spoken out loud when our daughter was born. I promised to protect her. I promised to guide her. And most of all, I promised that no matter what happened to us, she would never feel abandoned. When my wife's illness came, those promises grew heavier. She knew her time was short, and in those final weeks, she looked at me with eyes that burned with both love and worry. "Take care of her," she said. "She'll need you. She'll always need you." Those words were etched into me deeper than any scar. At the graveside, with my daughter trembling beside me, I had silently repeated them. I will take care of her. Always. And I did. Through every hardship, through every moment of doubt, I clung to those promises. When my daughter faltered in college after her mother's death, I reminded myself of my vow and carried her through it. When bills piled up and Michael couldn't cover them, I told myself that keeping her afloat was part of the oath I had made. When she called in tears after her first miscarriage, I drove hours in the middle of the night to hold her, because I could not break the promise to be there when she needed me most. But now, sitting in that bedroom, I wonder what those promises had truly cost me. They had kept me bound to her in ways that went beyond love. They had made me blind to the slow shifts in her loyalty, blind to the growing influence of Michael and his family. I had held so tightly to my duty that I never once demanded anything in return, not gratitude, not respect, not even acknowledgement. And in the end, the very promise meant to protect me had become the chain that allowed them to discard me. The betrayal of the baby shower wasn't just about missing a party. It was about standing in direct violation of everything I had promised to my wife. She had trusted me to keep the family together, to ensure that our daughter never felt alone. And yet, here I was, the one cast aside, the one left in the shadows while others celebrated. My wife would have never believed it possible. Neither would I. I stood and crossed the cedar chest, kneeling in front of it. The hinges creaked as I opened the lid, and the scent of old wood and fabric filled the room. Inside were pieces of a life. Photographs, letters, my wife's wedding dress folded carefully, and a small box of mementos from our daughter's childhood. I lifted out the box and sat within my lap, opening it slowly. Inside were the reminders of promises kept. Her first pair of shoes, worn thin at the soles from all the time she had run to the yard. A small drawing she had made in kindergarten of our family. 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. A birthday card she had made for me as a teenager, scribbled with "You're the best dad in the world." I stared at that card for a long time. The best dad in the world. That was how she once saw me. That was what my promises had made me in her eyes. But now, what was I? A man she could discard without hesitation. A man left behind while strangers toasted her new life. The ache in my chest was sharp, but beneath it was something else, a clarity that had eluded me before. My promises had not been mistakes. They were acts of love, and I would never regret them. But love without boundaries had turned those promises into tools others could exploit. My wife had asked me to take care of our daughter, and I had done that faithfully. But she had never asked me to lose myself in the process, never asked me to sacrifice my dignity. That loss was my doing, and it was one I could no longer allow. I set the box back in the chest and closed the lid, resting my hands on the wood. I whispered into the room, into the memory of my wife. I kept my word. I did everything I could. But now, it's time I kept a promise to myself, too. I rose and walked back to the study, where the papers still lay spread across the desk. Looking at them, I realized that I had more power than I had admitted. The mortgage payments I had covered, the accounts I had supported, the property still tied to my name, all of it gave me leverage. For years, I had treated those actions as gifts, tokens of love. But they were also investments, and now, those investments could speak louder than any words my daughter or Michael had thrown at me. As the evening wore on, I sat at the desk, tracing my finger across the lines of each document. With every page, I remembered not just the sacrifices I had made, but the reasons behind them. The promises, the love, the devotion. Those memories still mattered, but they no longer had to bind me. They could free me instead, free me to demand the respect I had been denied. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of my decisions beginning to settle. The betrayal had shaken me. The promises had haunted me. But now they were becoming the fuel for something else. A new promise. Not to her, not even to my wife, but to myself. I would not be erased. I would not be treated as an afterthought. The man who had once sacrificed everything out of love was still here, but he was no longer blind. And as I closed the folder of papers and set it neatly aside, I knew that this time my silence would not be the silence of patience. It would be the silence of preparation. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. For days, my mind had been circling around the same thoughts, the same images of being cut out of my daughter's life, the same sting of her words. Oh, we had it yesterday. But now, alongside that grief, there was something else, a quiet determination that had begun to take root. The papers on my desk weren't just reminders of sacrifice anymore. They were tools, and I needed to learn how to use them. I brewed myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, flipping open the phone book I kept tucked in the drawer. It was old, dog-eared, and smudged with years of fingerprints, but it still held what I needed. I ran my finger down the listings for attorneys, stopping at a name I vaguely recognized from town. This man had a reputation for being sharp, practical, and not easily swayed by sentiment. That was exactly what I needed now. Someone who would look at my situation without emotion and show me where my leverage truly lay. I dialed a number, and after a few rings, a receptionist answered. I explained that I wanted consultation, nothing more. She offered me an appointment later that week. And though part of me wanted it sooner, I knew waiting those few days would give me time to gather everything I needed. I agreed, hung up, and immediately began pulling together documents. Bank statements, mortgage receipts, proof of the payments I had made on their behalf. Even old letters where my daughter had thanked me for helping her through tough times. Each piece felt like a brick in the case I was quietly beginning to build. When the day of the appointment finally came, I put on my best jacket, not fancy, just neat, clean, and pressed. I wanted to walk into that office not as a broken old man seeking pity, but as someone who had been wronged and was ready to stand up for himself. The law office was in a modest building on the edge of town, nothing flashy, just a brass plaque by the door with the attorney's name. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, lined with shelves of law books and photographs of the attorney shaking hands with local officials. The receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to take a seat. My hands itched with nervous energy as I sat there, the folder of documents heavy in my lap. After a short wait, I was ushered into a corner office where the attorney sat behind a large wooden desk. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything and a voice that carried the steady calm of someone used to sorting out other people's troubles. He gestured for me to sit and asked what had brought me in. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about betrayal, about respect, about being erased from the very family I had sacrificed everything for. But I knew I had to keep my story clear, focused. So I started with the facts, the financial support I had given my daughter and her husband, the mortgage payments I had covered, the loans I had taken on their behalf. I laid out the documents one by one, explaining the timeline, the amounts, the circumstances. As I spoke, the attorney listened carefully, occasionally jotting down notes. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush me, just let me lay everything out. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You've been generous," he said plainly. "Very generous. And from what you've shown me, you have proof of every payment, every transfer. That matters." I nodded, my throat tight. I didn't do it to have leverage. I did it because I promised her mother I'd always take care of her. But now, after everything, I need to know what rights I still have, what I can do to make sure I'm not pushed aside. The attorney's eyes narrowed slightly, but not unkindly. "You may feel like you've been taken advantage of, and from where I'm sitting, you're right. You've given them financial support without asking for any formal agreements in return. That puts you in a weaker position legally, but not without options." He began to explain in detail. Some of the mortgage payments I had covered, he said, could be considered loans if I chose to classify them that way, particularly since I had records and receipts. If I filed properly, I could establish that they owed me repayment. Beyond that, he pointed out that my name was still attached to certain property accounts, an oversight on their part, but one that gave me standing in decisions they might assume were theirs alone. As he spoke, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. My years of sacrifice had left a paper trail, and that paper trail gave me power. I had thought of myself as powerless, cast aside, but in reality, I was still tied to their financial stability in ways they had probably forgotten. The attorney leaned forward. The real question is, what do you want? Do you want repayment? Do you want control? Do you want to cut ties and walk away? The strategy depends on your goal. I sat there in silence for a moment, weighing the question. What did I want? Revenge? No, not in the simple sense. I didn't want to destroy them, but I also couldn't let them continue believing I was someone they could discard without consequence. What I wanted was respect, recognition, proof that I mattered. I don't want to ruin her life, I said finally, my voice steady. She's still my daughter, but I won't let them erase me. I want her to understand that everything she stands on, everything she takes for granted, exists because of me. I want them to realize that I'm not an afterthought. The attorney nodded slowly. Then you need to assert your position. Quietly, firmly, legally. We can draft letters, file notices, bring the financial ties into the open. It doesn't have to be loud or public at first, but will remind them and her that you are not someone who can be brushed aside. Hearing those words was like feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since the baby shower betrayal, I felt a sense of control, however small. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. The years of sacrifice that I had once thought were wasted could now become the very foundation of my strength. As the consultation ended, the attorney gathered the documents neatly back into the folder and handed them to me. Think about your next step, he said. Don't act out of anger. Act with purpose. That's how you'll make sure this doesn't happen again. I shook his hand firmly before leaving, my grip stronger than I expected. Walking back to my car, the air felt different, crisp, sharp, alive with possibility. The betrayal still hurt, but now it was no longer just a wound. It was the beginning of something else. When I drove home, the folder sat on the seat beside me like a quiet companion, a reminder of the power I still held. And as the road stretched out ahead, I knew one thing for certain. My silence with the attorney's words echoed in my head for days afterward. Don't act out of anger. Act with purpose. They repeated themselves in the quiet hours of the night when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and in the mornings when I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the folder of documents spread across the wood. The betrayal still stung, but now there was a different current running beneath it. Not just grief, but resolve. I knew what I had to do. For years, I had been the one to bend, the one to compromise, the one to stay silent. But silence had brought me here. Excluded from my own daughter's baby shower. Treated as if my sacrifices counted for nothing. Now it was time to make my presence felt in a way that could not be ignored. The first step, the attorney had explained, was filing the proper papers. Formal recognition of the debts, the payments, the ties they had tried to pretend did not exist. I spent an entire Sunday organizing the folder until it was perfect. Receipts in chronological order. Bank transfers highlighted. Mortgage stubs neatly stacked. Each sheet of paper was like a memory carved into ink. Proof of nights spent calculating how to stretch my paycheck. Proof of sacrifices that had cost me more than just money. Proof that without me, they would have collapsed long ago. Monday morning came, and with it, a sense of gravity. I dressed with unusual care, buttoning a crisp shirt and pulling on my best jacket, the same one I had worn to graduations and funerals. This wasn't just paperwork. This was a declaration, not only to them, but to myself. I would no longer allow my love to be mistaken for weakness. The county clerk's office was housed in an older brick building downtown, its tall windows streaked by years of rain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust, the kind of scent that lingers in places where records outlive generations. The floors were polished but worn, echoing faintly with each step I took. I approached the counter, where a woman with glasses perched low on her nose looked up at me. She had the patient expression of someone who had seen everything and was not easily surprised. "Can I help you?" she asked. I cleared my throat and placed the folder on the counter. "Yes, I need to file documentation of financial support as loans. I've been advised by my attorney that I have standing to make claims." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded, sliding the folder closer and beginning to leaf through the pages. "Do you have the forms completed?" "Yes," I said, handing over the set the attorney had helped me prepare. I had gone over them half a dozen times the night before, making sure every line was filled, every figure correct. She took them, stamped them with a firm thud that seemed to echo through the entire office, and slid a copy back to me. "You'll get confirmation in the mail, but as of today, it's on record." The sound of that stamp was like a gavel striking wood. Final, irrevocable. For years, my sacrifices had existed in the shadows, acknowledged only in quiet conversations and fading gratitude. Now, they were written into the public record, undeniable and permanent. I stepped away from the counter, clutching the stamped copy in my hand, and for a moment, I just stood there in the lobby, letting the weight of it sink in. It wasn't joy I felt, and it wasn't exactly anger either. It was something steadier, a calm assurance that I had taken the first step out of the shadows they had forced me into. On the drive home, the paper sat on the passenger seat, the stamp shining faintly in the sunlight streaming through the windshield. I glanced at them again and again, each time feeling a little stronger. The betrayal had not been erased. Nothing could take away the pain of hearing my daughter's indifference. But now, I was no longer just a victim of it. I was acting. Back at home, I placed a stamped copy in my desk drawer, locking it away with a sense of ritual. Then I sat down and wrote out a letter as the attorney had advised. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise, factual, and unyielding. I outlined the financial contributions I had made, attached copies of the receipts, and stated clearly that these were now formally recognized as loans on record. I addressed it to both my daughter and Michael, sealing it in an envelope and setting it on the table where I couldn't ignore it. That letter sat there for 2 days before I mailed it. Every time I passed the table, I looked at it, my chest tightening. Part of me still recoiled at the thought of confronting my own daughter in such a cold, official way. But then I would hear her voice again in my head. "Oh, we had it yesterday." And the hesitation would harden into resolve. When I finally walked into the post office and handed the envelope to the clerk, I felt that same strange mixture of grief and empowerment. Dropping it into the system meant there was no turning back. The words inside would reach her soon, and when they did, she would finally have to look at me not as a background figure, not as someone she could ignore, but as a man whose sacrifices had weight, whose presence could not be erased. That evening, after the letter was sent, I sat on the porch watching the sun dip low behind the trees. The air was cool, the sky streaked with shades of gold and red. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally stopped letting betrayal control me. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. The road ahead was still uncertain. I knew there would be backlash, that Michael and his family would not take kindly to being confronted. I knew my daughter might see it as aggression rather than protection. But I also knew that silence had got me nowhere, and action, even difficult action, was the only way forward. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands over my stomach, and let the weight of the day settle over me. The betrayal had left me broken, yes, but filing those papers, sending that letter, had built something new inside me. A spine, a voice, a promise. Not to anyone else this time, but to myself. The letter had been sent, and all I could do was wait. In those first days, I found myself listening more closely than usual for the sound of the mail truck passing down the street. I knew when they received it, the silence between us would break, one way or another. My daughter and Michael might respond with anger, confusion, or perhaps even shame, though shame seemed the least likely of the three. What I knew for certain was that my decision had set something in motion that could not be undone. It was the 4th evening after mailing the letter when the phone rang. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when the shrill sound broke the silence of the house. I dried my hands quickly and picked up the receiver. "Dad." Her voice was sharp, clipped, and already filled with tension. She didn't even bother with hello. "Yes," I said slowly, bracing myself. "What is this?" she demanded. "What is this letter about loans and payments? What are you doing?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I answered. It's exactly what it says. I've formally recorded the financial support I've given you and Michael as loans. I'm not asking for anything today, but I'm making sure it's recognized. I won't be erased from the picture anymore. There was a pause, filled with her uneven breathing. Then came a reply, louder now. You can't be serious. Dad, this is insane. You're threatening us over money? After everything you've done willingly? No one asked you to do those things. You chose to. Her words stung, not because they were true, but because of how easily she twisted the story. I swallowed hard. Yes, I chose to help. I chose to cover the mortgage when Michael lost his job. I chose to step in when bills piled up. I did it because I love you. But love doesn't mean I should be cast aside like I never mattered. That's what your silence at the baby shower did to me. I won't let you forget what I've given or who I am. She was silent for a moment, and I almost hoped she was reflecting. But then another voice entered the call, Michael. His tone was colder, harsher. This is harassment, old man. You can't just decide years later that gifts are loans. You'll embarrass yourself if you try. My grip on the receiver tightened. Michael, you've lived off my sacrifices for years. Don't talk to me about embarrassment. Every receipt, every transfer is in black and white. Whether you like it or not, it's on record now. He let out a bitter laugh. This is pathetic. You think you're going to bully us with paperwork? You should be ashamed. Do you know how this looks, Dad? You're turning on your own daughter, on your grandchild, before the baby is even born. His words were meant to cut, and for a moment, they almost did. But then I reminded myself why I had acted in the first place. No, Michael, I'm not turning on my daughter. I'm reminding her that her father still exists, that her father's sacrifices cannot be brushed aside while you play house and pretend none of it matters. There was another pause, heavier this time. I could hear my daughter crying softly in the background, her sobs muffled but unmistakable. For a moment, my chest ached, the instinct to comfort her, to take back everything, to soothe her pain was still there, buried deep. But over that ache, the sharper truth pressed down. She had made her choices. She had excluded me. She had forced this distance. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. Why are you doing this, Dad? Why now? Why can't you just let it go? We're about to have a baby. We should be celebrating, not fighting. I closed my eyes, steadying my breathing before answering. Because you already celebrated without me. You made sure I wasn't there. You cut me out as if I don't matter. That day, I realized I had let myself become invisible, and I promised myself that would never happen again. You may not like what I'm doing, but you will never ignore me again. Her crying deepened, and Michael's voice rose once more, angry and sharp. We'll see about that. You're not the only one who can play games with lawyers and papers. You want to fight? You'll get one. The line went dead before I could reply. I stood there in the kitchen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence buzzing through the wires. Slowly, I set it back in its cradle. The call had left me shaken, but not broken. Their anger was proof that the letter had struck exactly where it needed to. For years, they had relied on my silence, my endless patience. Now, they were confronted with a version of me they didn't recognize, a man who refused to be dismissed. The next morning, I found an email from my daughter waiting in my inbox. The subject line was just one word. Why? The message itself was longer, written in hurried sentences that blurred between pleading and blaming. She said she couldn't believe I would put this kind of pressure on her during her pregnancy, that I was tearing the family apart, that Michael was furious, that I was risking my place in my grandchild's life. She reminded me of the promises I had made to Mom, as if invoking her memory could shame me back into compliance. I read the message 3 times, each time feeling the conflict pull at me. The mention of my wife cut deep, reopening wounds I thought I had closed. But beneath the ache was a steady resolve. This was exactly why I had acted. They were using her memory, my promises, my sacrifices, as chains to bind me into silence. I couldn't let that continue. I wrote back carefully, every word chosen with precision. I told her I loved her, that I loved the baby I hadn't met yet, that nothing could ever change that. But I also told her that love did not mean erasing myself. I explained that the papers were not punishment, but recognition, acknowledgement of what had been done, what had been given, what could no longer be ignored. I told her I would not back down. Not this time. When I clicked send, my hands trembled, but not from fear. It was the tremor of a man who had finally stopped begging to be seen and had chosen to stand tall instead. That evening, I sat again on the porch, watching the sun dip low. The phone stayed silent, but I knew the silence wouldn't last. They would come back with anger, with threats, maybe even with lawyers of their own. But whatever came, I was ready, because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting from weakness. It didn't take long for the fallout to spread beyond my daughter's household. At first, the tension stayed contained in the phone calls and emails between us, the sharp words exchanged late at night when emotions ran hottest. But then, slowly, almost predictably, whispers began making their way through the rest of the family and into the wider community. It started with a phone call from my sister, Margaret. She lived 2 towns over, but she had always been in touch with my daughter. Her voice was cautious when she called, but I could hear the curiosity pressing underneath. "I just want to check in," she said after a few pleasantries. "I heard from your daughter that there's been some kind of misunderstanding." I nearly laughed at the word. Misunderstanding. That was the word my daughter had chosen, apparently, to describe years of sacrifice being erased and me finally refusing to stay silent. I took a breath and explained my side, sticking to the facts. The mortgage payments, the loans, the betrayal of being excluded. Margaret listened, but I could sense the hesitation in her silence. "Well," she said finally, "I can see how you feel hurt, but you know how young couples are. They're under stress, trying to make their own way. Maybe they didn't mean anything by it." Her words stung, not because I hadn't expected them, but because they mirrored the same pattern I had lived through for years. Excuses. Always excuses for my daughter and her husband, as if my role was to absorb every slight, every oversight, and never ask for acknowledgement. After that call, I knew the story was spreading, and that Michael was likely doing his part to twist it in his favor. Sure enough, the next time I went to the grocery store, I noticed a shift in the way people greeted me. Some neighbors offered tight, polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Others avoided me altogether. One old friend, a man I'd known for decades, approached me in the parking lot and asked bluntly, "Is it true you're suing your own daughter?" The rumor had mutated. What I had filed as a formal recognition of debt, a paper trail to preserve the truth, had become suing my daughter in the mouths of others. I felt heat rise in my chest as I explained, again, calmly, factually, that I wasn't suing anyone, that I had simply put into record what I had given so it could not be erased. But I could tell from his expression that the damage had already been done. People hear what they want to hear, and in small towns, stories grow legs of their own. By the end of that week, it was clear that the divide was real. Some people, especially those who had known me closely for years, offered quiet support. My neighbor across the street stopped by one evening, leaned on my fence, and said, "I heard the talk. Don't let it get to you. Folks around here forget quick. But I know what kind of man you are. You've always been there for your family. If they're making you the villain now, that's on them, not you." His words steadied me, but they couldn't drown out the louder voices that came from Michael's side. Michael's family was large and well-connected, and soon enough, I heard that they were telling anyone who would listen that I was bitter, controlling, and trying to destroy my daughter's happiness out of spite. One of them even confronted me at the hardware store, saying, "She's pregnant. For God's sake, how can you put her through this? Shame on you." I walked out without replying, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. But inside, I knew the truth. Their anger meant they were rattled. If they truly believed I was powerless, if they truly thought I had no right to stand up, they wouldn't be working so hard to poison others against me. The hardest part, though, wasn't the community gossip. It was a reaction from extended family. A few cousins called, urging me to be the bigger person and let it go. One even suggested that I apologize to my daughter before things went too far. The suggestion cut deep, because it revealed how little they understood, or perhaps how much they had already been swayed by Michael's version of events. But there were others, too. A niece I hadn't spoken to in years sent me a message on social media, saying she admired me for finally standing up for myself. I watched my mom do the same thing, give and give until there was nothing left, she wrote. She never found the courage to say enough. You did. Don't back down. Her words brought me an unexpected surge of strength. For every voice trying to shame me back into silence, there was another voice, quieter maybe but truer, that reminded me I wasn't alone. Still, the divide grew. Family gatherings that once might have included me were suddenly postponed or held without my knowledge. I heard about them afterward through the grapevine, the same way I had heard about the baby shower. It was clear that a line had been drawn, and I was on one side while my daughter and Michael held court on the other. It hurt more than I can put into words. To feel not just the loss of my daughter's closeness, but the erosion of the entire network of family ties I had spent a lifetime nurturing. Yet at the same time, beneath the ache, there was a strange kind of clarity. This divide, painful as it was, stripped away illusions. It showed me who was truly willing to see me for who I was, and who preferred the easier story that painted me as the villain. I realized something else during those weeks. The divide wasn't entirely a curse. It was also a shield. The people who stood against me made it clear that I could no longer count on their approval, their affection, or their support. And that freed me. I no longer had to twist myself into knots trying to please them, to prove my worth. For the first time in decades, I began to understand that standing alone could be stronger than standing surrounded by people who only value me when I was silent. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the light fade, I thought of my wife. I wondered what she would think of this divide, of the way our daughter had chosen Michael's version of family over mine. It hurt to imagine her disappointment. But then I remembered her last words to me. Take care of her. She'll need you. I realized I had misinterpreted them all these years. Taking care of her didn't mean allowing myself to be diminished. It meant showing her what strength looked like, even if it meant standing against her choices. It meant protecting her from the consequences of forgetting where she came from, even if she hated me for it. The community divide had made one thing crystal clear. This was no longer just about family disagreements. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to let myself be erased, no matter how many whispers followed me in grocery store aisles or how many relatives urged me bend. I stood, took a long breath, and went back inside. The storm outside was growing, but inside me, a different storm had settled into something steady, something resolute. They could divide the community. They could twist the story. They could paint me as the villain. But the truth was now on record, and I had no intention of backing down. The divide in the community had already made life heavier, but I knew it was only a matter of time before Michael tried to push things further. He was never the kind of man to let a situation lie quietly. He thrived on control, on making sure he had the upper hand, and my letter had stripped that illusion from him. What I didn't expect was how quickly he would escalate, nor how public he would try to make it. It began with another phone call, but this one wasn't from my daughter. It was from an unfamiliar number. I answered, expecting perhaps a telemarketer, but instead, I heard a stern voice on the other end introduce himself as an attorney, representing Michael and my daughter. My grip on the phone tightened as he explained that my claims of loans were being disputed, that they consider my actions to be mischaracterizations, and that they expected me to formally withdraw the filings before further action was taken. I didn't argue with him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of my anger. I simply said I would refer the matter to my own attorney, and hung up the phone. But inside, my chest burned. Michael had gone running to a lawyer, not protect my daughter, but to scare me into backing down. I drove immediately to my attorney's office, the stamped copy of my filing still safe in my desk drawer home. When I explained what had happened, he listened carefully, then gave me a slow, steady smile. "This is bluster," he said. "They're lawyers doing what they're paid to do, intimidate, but they have no basis to erase your filings. The records exist, the paper trail exists, and you are within your rights. The question isn't whether they can silence you. The question is whether you're prepared to weather their retaliation." I nodded, though the weight of it pressed heavy on me. I had prepared myself for anger, for coldness, for gossip, but hearing that Michael and my daughter had actually retained an attorney made the rift feel even more permanent. And then came the social side of their retaliation. I had thought the gossip in the community was bad enough, but now it became something sharper, almost coordinated. Michael's family began hosting dinners and gatherings where they made a point of airing their grievances loudly, in ways that travel fast. Friends told me that at one of these dinners, Michael stood up, glass in hand, and said, "Some people just can't stand to see their children succeed without them. Some people would rather drag everyone down than let go." He never said my name, but he didn't have to. Everyone in that room, everyone who heard the story later, knew exactly who he meant. The hardest blow came when I learned that even at church, whispers were spreading. A place that had once been my refuge now felt tinged with suspicion. A deacon I'd known for years pulled me aside after service one Sunday and asked, "Is it true you're suing your daughter over a house?" People are talking. I had to explain yet again that I wasn't suing anyone, that I had only filed to recognize the debts. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way years of trust could be eroded by a few poisoned words repeated often enough. Through it all, my daughter remained silent. She didn't call again after the first explosive conversation. She didn't reply to my last email. Instead, it was Michael's voice, Michael's narrative, that filled the silence. And that silence hurt far more than the gossip or the threats. Because if she had wanted to, she could have stopped it. She could have stood up for me, defended me, reminded people of the truth. Instead, she let Michael define me as the villain. One evening, after another day of tight-lipped stares and half-truths, I received a letter in the mail. It was printed on the letterhead of Michael's attorney. The words were dressed up in legal formality, but the meaning was plain. They were demanding I withdraw the filings immediately, threatening to pursue damages if I didn't. I read it through twice, then set it on the kitchen table and just sat there staring at it. The old me, the man who had always bent, always compromised, always stayed silent, would have been tempted to give in, to avoid the fight, to restore some illusion of peace. But that man was gone. The betrayal at the baby's shower had buried him. What sat in his place now was a man who understood that dignity meant standing firm, even when the storm howled around him. The next morning, I drove to my attorney's office again and handed him the letter. He read it, snorted softly, and placed it in a file. "Empty threats," he said. "They want you to blink first. Don't. Let them waste their money if they want to push this further. They'll find there's less ground under them than they think." So I didn't blink. I didn't withdraw. I didn't respond to Michael's attempts to paint me as the villain. Instead, I carried on quietly, living my days with as much normalcy as I could manage, even as the undercurrent of conflict rippled through everything. But retaliation doesn't always come dressed in lawsuits or gossip. Sometimes it comes in more personal ways. A week later, I opened my mailbox to find a stack of photos. Pictures from the baby's shower. Smiling faces, balloons, gifts piled high. My daughter was in the center of it all, glowing, surrounded by people who had been invited, while I sat at home in silence. No note, no explanation, just a photo stuffed into an envelope with my name written on the front. It was Michael, of course. His cruel little way of twisting the knife. A reminder of what I had been excluded from, as if to say, "See, we're happy without you." I sat at the table, staring at those photos for a long time. My hands trembled, but not from weakness, from anger, from the steady burn of a man who realized he was being tested, pushed, baited into breaking. But I didn't break. I slid the photos back into the envelope, locked them away in my desk, and refused to let them undo me. Their retaliation was loud, messy, cruel. My response was quiet, steady, immovable. I would not match their fire with fire. That was what they wanted. No, my strength would be in calm refusal, in showing them that their tactics could not bend me, because I knew something they didn't. Retaliation, no matter how loud, is a sign of fear. They were afraid of losing control, afraid of the truth on record, afraid that their carefully constructed image of independence and strength was built on a foundation they didn't own. And I was that foundation. The envelope with the baby's shower photos sat in my desk drawer like a stone. I didn't throw it away, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I left it there as a reminder not of what I had lost, but of why I had acted in the first place. Every time I thought of softening, of bending back into silence, I would think of those pictures, mailed to me not as a kind gesture, but as a weapon, and I would remember that giving in would only invite more of the same. Still, the pressure didn't stop. If anything, it grew. Michael and his attorney fired off more letters, each one dressed in intimidating language, but saying the same thing. Withdraw the filings, admit you were wrong, and this can go away. I kept every letter, placing them neatly in a folder, but I never let them provoke me into rashness. Each time, I would meet with my attorney, who would shake his head and tell me the same thing. They're trying to break you down. Don't move. You're stronger when you're still. Outside the legal skirmishes, the personal attacks became sharper. My daughter sent me long texts late at night, words spilling out in angry bursts. Why are you doing this? Don't you see you're ruining everything? You'll never meet your grandchild if you keep this up. Michael says you've lost it. Everyone thinks you've lost it. Just stop before it's too late. Reading her words cut deeper than I care to admit. Threats about never meeting my grandchild struck at the softest part of me. But I refuse to let her see that. I refuse to respond with pleading or desperation. Instead, I typed back messages that were short, steady, almost cold. I love you. I love the baby. But I will not erase myself. This isn't about ruining things. It's about standing for the truth. When you're ready to see that, I'll be here. No anger, no argument, just calm refusal. At first, her replies came fast and furious. Paragraphs of blame, accusations that I was selfish, heartless, controlling. I let them come, and I answered each one with the same steady hand. Eventually, the messages slowed. I think she began to realize she could not bait me into rage, nor shame me back into silence. My calmness unnerved her more than my anger ever could have. Michael, of course, took another approach. He showed up once, unannounced, pulling into my driveway in his truck and slamming the door hard enough to echo across the street. I stepped out onto the porch, not moving toward him, simply standing with my hands folded in front of me. He stormed up halfway before stopping, pointing a finger at me. You think you're clever, don't you? Sitting up there acting calm while you stab us in the back. Let me tell you something. Old man, you won't win. You'll end up alone, and when that baby comes, you won't even know their name. His words rang out across the yard, sharp and venomous. My neighbors had started peeking out their windows, drawn by the noise. I felt their eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond. And in that moment, I understood the power I held. I didn't shout back. I didn't step down from the porch. I simply looked at him, steady and unflinching, and said, Michael, I already am alone, and I would rather be alone with my dignity intact than surrounded by people who think they can erase me. You can shout as much as you want. You can threaten me with absence, but I will not move. For a moment, the anger on his face faltered, just a flicker, but enough to see that my calmness unsettled him. He wanted a fight, a scene, something he could twist into more gossip. When I gave him nothing but refusal, he had nowhere to go. He muttered something under his breath, turned sharply, and stomped back to his truck. The engine roared, and then he was gone. The silence that followed was almost profound. My neighbor's curtains shifted back into place. The air felt heavy, but not with shame, with a strange kind of pride. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't stooped to his level. And in doing so, I had won that small battle. But calm refusal isn't just about standing against others. It's about standing against yourself, against the old instincts that want to compromise just to keep peace. In the days that followed, I had to fight those instincts constantly. Every time I saw a family walking together at the park, every time I passed a baby aisle in the store, my heart ached. The temptation whispered, give in, withdraw, apologize. Maybe then you'll be invited back. But then I would think of the baby shower. I would think of the photos in the envelope, mailed to me like an insult, and I would remind myself, what kind of grandfather would I be if I taught my grandchild that love means letting yourself be erased? No, If I ever met that child, I wanted them to know me as a man who stood his ground, not one who surrendered his dignity for scraps of approval. The community noticed, too. Where once the whispers had carried weight, now some began to shift. People saw Michael shouting in my driveway and me standing calm. They saw the way I carried myself at church, steady and quiet, even as rumors swirled. Slowly, the narrative began to tilt. A few people who had kept their distance began greeting me more warmly again, as if they respected the fact that I hadn't been broken by the storm. One older woman, a longtime friend of my late wife, pulled me aside after service. She placed a hand on my arm and said softly, "I've heard things, terrible things, but I've also watched you, and I know a steady heart when I see one. Don't let them take it from you." Her words stayed with me. A steady heart. That was what I was building, piece by piece, refusal by refusal. Michael and my daughter continued their retaliation. More letters, more gossip, more attempts to paint me as the villain. But each time, I met it with the same calm response. No anger, no collapse, just a movable refusal. It wasn't easy. The silence from my daughter gnawed at me in quiet moments. The thought of not meeting my grandchild was a shadow that followed me everywhere. But I learned to live with the shadow, to carry it without letting it bend me. And in that endurance, I found a kind of power I had never known before. For years, I had believed that strength meant action, paying bills, fixing problems, smoothing over conflicts. Now I understood that true strength sometimes meant stillness. True strength meant refusing to be shaken, even when the storm was designed to tear you down. By the end of that chapter in the conflict, I had earned something I hadn't expected: respect. Not from Michael, not from the relatives who chose to side with him, but from those who watched quietly, who saw the difference between noise and dignity. I had not shouted. I had not lashed out. And yet, in my calm refusal, I had said more than words ever could, because in the end, the retaliation had revealed itself for what it was: fear disguised as anger, and I had shown them that fear could not move me. By the time the second legal letter arrived, I no longer felt the jolt of anger or panic that used to grip me whenever Michael or his attorney tried to push me. I read the letter carefully, placed it in the growing file, and closed the drawer without a second thought. It was no longer about reacting to them. It was about finishing what I had started. For months, I had endured their lies, their manipulation, their attempts to shame me into silence. I had stood calm while they tried to break me down. Now it was time to take the next step, not loud, not impulsive, but deliberate. I sat at my desk that evening and laid out everything in front of me: the folder of receipts, canceled checks, bank transfers, every scrap of proof that showed the truth of what I had given my daughter and Michael over the years. Mortgage payments, utility bills, repairs, loans that were never repaid. The numbers stretched back more than a decade. I remembered each one vividly, because each time I wrote one of those checks, I had told myself it was an act of love. That love had been twisted into something ugly, used against me, and erased with a lie. Now it was time to let the truth stand on its own. My attorney had advised me that if they kept pushing, I had every right to escalate formally. That meant not only filing the debt recognition, but attaching supporting documentation in a way that could not be dismissed as hearsay or exaggeration. It would become part of the public record, visible to anyone who wanted to see it. It wasn't about shaming them, though I knew it would sting, but about making sure no one could ever again twist the story to paint me as selfish or delusional. As I organized the papers, I thought about the irony. They had been so determined to make me look like the villain in the community, spreading whispers, twisting my intentions, painting me as a bitter old man trying to ruin his daughter's happiness. But once the records were in the open, everyone would see what had really happened. Years of me carrying them, years of me providing stability, they pretended was their own doing. The next day, I drove to my attorney's office with a folder tucked under my arm. He looked it over slowly, his eyes scanning each receipt, each note, each signature. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked at me with something that almost resembled pride. "This," he said, tapping the folder, "is airtight. If they want to keep pushing, let them. But once this goes in, the story shifts. Not just legally, socially. They can't claim you imagined it. They can't call it exaggeration. It'll be there in black and white for anyone who doubts you. That was all I needed to hear. I authorized him to move forward, and as I left his office, I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time, it wasn't just about defense. It was about action. Meanwhile, Michael and my daughter had no idea what was coming. They were still playing their games, still trying to manipulate me through silence and gossip. My daughter sent another message, this one dripping with false sweetness. "Dad, if you just drop all this, we can move forward. You can still be part of the baby's life. Don't let this fight define us." I read it twice before replying. I didn't lash out, didn't remind her the cruelty of excluding me from the baby's shower, didn't mention the photos Michael had shoved into my mailbox. I simply replied, "I will not erase myself. The truth will stand." That was it. No more. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just securing my position with the filings. I had another move in play, one that would hit closer to home. For years, the house my daughter and Michael lived in had been tied up in a series of informal agreements. I had helped with the down payment, covered several years of mortgage payments, even paid off a large repair after a storm damaged the roof. But the paperwork still linked my name to certain parts of the property records. Michael had always brushed it off, assuming I would never push the issue. But now, as my attorney reminded me, I had the right to call those obligations due. And I decided I would, not out of spite, but out of principle. They had taken my silence as weakness. They had mistaken my generosity for obligation. It was time they understood that every action had consequences. The formal notices went out the following week. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looked like vengeance. Just cold, professional documents that outlined what was owed and clarified my legal standing. The kind of papers that carried far more weight than gossip or accusations ever could. It didn't take long for the retaliation to shift into panic. Michael called me late one night, his voice raised, laced with profanity. He accused me of trying to ruin them, of being heartless, of abandoning my daughter when she needed me most. I let him rant, the phone pressed quietly to my ear until he finally demanded, "Are you going to back down, or are you really going through with this?" My answer was steady, calm, and final. "I already have gone through with it. You should have thought of that before you mailed me those pictures." There was silence on the line. For the first time, I think he realized the fight had changed. He hung up without another word. In the days that followed, I heard the ripple effect. Their voices in the community grew louder, more desperate. But now, people weren't so quick to believe them. Some had already begun to whisper about the documents, about the filings that were now public record. A neighbor who had once looked at me with suspicion stopped me at the store and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you'd done for them." Folks are starting to talk about it differently now. The tide was turning. It wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. No shouting matches, no public scenes. My revenge was quieter, sharper, rooted in truth. By putting everything on record, by calmly following process, I had flipped the story they had tried to tell. They had wanted me to be the bitter old man lashing out. Instead, I was the steady hand, the patient voice, the man who simply let the truth speak for itself. And the truth was devastating to them. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and raised it in the quiet. Not to victory. It wasn't finished yet, but to resolve. I had escalated, and the path ahead was clear. Michael and my daughter could scream. They could spread lies. They could try to cut me out. But the truth was stronger, and it was now written where no one could erase it. For the first time since the baby's shower, I felt a deep calm settle over me. Not the fragile calm of silence, but the solid calm of the man who had reclaimed his place. And I knew, as I set the glass down and looked at the papers neatly filed away, that the final strike was coming. The weeks after my filings became public were unlike anything I had experienced before. For months I had felt as though I were shouting into a void, dismissed as bitter, isolated by whispers, erased from the life of my daughter and her growing family. But suddenly, it was as if the story had flipped on its head. The silence I had kept, the steady refusal to lash out, had created space for the truth to settle in. And once the truth found footing, it spread faster than the lies ever had. People who had once turned their faces when I passed now nodded at me again, some with a kind of shame in their eyes. At the grocery store, one man I'd known casually for years came up to me, lowered his voice, and said, "I read the filings. Didn't realize how much you'd carried them. Seems like folks judge too quick." His words weren't dramatic, but they meant more to me than he knew. It wasn't vindication in court or in some loud confrontation. It was vindication, the quiet acknowledgement that I had never lied, never exaggerated, never tried to be anything other than a man who kept his family afloat. But Michael and my daughter weren't ready to let go. They made one last push, perhaps sensing their control was slipping for good. Their attorney filed a formal objection, claiming my filings were spite-driven and meant to harass. They requested a probate status hearing, one final attempt to paint me as the villain in front of an audience. I could have dreaded it. In another life, the thought of standing in a courthouse while my daughter sat across the aisle from me would have broken me. But by then, I had built something stronger inside myself. Calm refusal had hardened into quiet strength. I welcomed the hearing because it meant everything would be laid bare in the open, under oath, without room for gossip or manipulation. The day of the hearing, I arrived early, dressed in a clean suit I hadn't worn in years. As I walked into the courthouse, I felt the weight of what was about to happen, but I carried it with steady steps. My attorney sat beside me, his briefcase filled with the same documents I had once spread across my desk in the middle of the night. When my daughter entered with Michael at her side, I forced myself not to look away. She glanced at me only once, quickly, her face tight, her belly now rounded with the weight of her pregnancy. It struck me then, sharp and deep, that the child she carried was still my grandchild. Nothing could erase that fact, no matter how much Michael tried. But I pushed the thought down, steadying myself for what had to come. The judge called the matter to order, and Michael's attorney spoke first, his words smooth and sharp, crafted to sting. He described me as vindictive, controlling, obsessed with exacting punishment on my daughter for imagined slights. He painted Michael and my daughter as victims of my bitterness, struggling to build a life while I dragged them into unnecessary legal battles. I sat still, hands folded, my face calm. Not once did I interrupt. Not once did I allow anger to break my expression. When he finished, the judge turned to my attorney, who rose slowly, opened the briefcase, and began to lay out the documents one by one. Mortgage checks, repair invoices, utility bills, bank transfers, my signature, their signatures, notes written in my daughter's handwriting asking for help. Each piece was entered into the record, each piece undeniable. My attorney didn't need to embellish or argue. He simply laid out the truth, calm and steady, the way I had chosen to live these past months. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, with each document presented. Michael shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. My daughter looked down at her lap, her hands clenched together. The judge's face remained neutral, but I could see his eyes following each page, taking the sheer weight of evidence. When it was over, my attorney spoke plainly. This is not harassment. This is recognition of debts incurred and never acknowledged. My client has no desire to harm his daughter or her husband. He seeks only for the truth to stand in its proper place, as it always should have. The judge took a long moment before responding. Finally, he said, "The record is clear. The filings stand. Any objection is denied." And just like that, it was done. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed in my chest like a release. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't lashed out. I had simply stood firm, let the truth be seen, and now it was written into the record of the court itself. No one could erase it. As people began to leave, I sat for a moment longer, letting the weight of it sink in. When I finally rose, I caught one last glimpse of my daughter. She didn't look at me, didn't speak. Michael ushered her out quickly, his hand on her back. But I saw something in her posture, a slouch of defeat, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. She knew. Deep down, she knew the truth was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, the sun was high, the air crisp. I walked slowly down the steps, each stride steadier than the last. For the first time since the baby shower, I felt peace. Not the peace of reconciliation. That may never come. But the peace of a man who has reclaimed his dignity. In the weeks that followed, things grew quiet. Michael and my daughter didn't call, didn't write, didn't send more letters. Perhaps they were regrouping. Or perhaps they finally realized they had lost. The gossip in the community slowed, replaced by a kind of uneasy respect. People who had once looked at me with suspicion now saw me as the man who had stood his ground without ever raising his voice. One afternoon, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea, the late summer sun warm on my face. A neighbor stopped by, leaned against a railing, and said simply, "You did right. They might not say it now, but one day she'll remember what you've done for her." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded, because I knew he might be right. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe my daughter would never forgive me, never understand. But forgiveness wasn't the point anymore. The point was that I had refused to be erased. I had refused to let lies define me. And in that refusal, I had found peace. Later that night, I opened the desk drawer and took out the envelope of baby shower photos. I looked at them again, the smiling faces, the balloons, the gifts. This time, they didn't sting the way they once had. They were just pictures of a day I hadn't been invited to. Nothing more, nothing less. I slipped them back into the envelope, returned it to the drawer, and closed it softly. Because the truth was, I no longer needed to prove myself to anyone. The record was set. The dignity was mine. And whatever came next, whether reconciliation or permanent distance, I was ready to face it with a steady heart. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, sat back in my chair, and let the silence fill the room. Not the heavy silence of betrayal, not the suffocating silence of being excluded, but the quiet of a man who had endured the storm and come out whole. It was not the ending I once imagined, but it was enough. It was peace.